Welcome to My Healthy Mind. I'm Elizabeth Atkins.
And I'm Michael Hunter. Today we're talking with someone who needs no introduction, Justice Richard Bernstein, Michigan Supreme Court Justice and a member of the esteemed and well-known Bernstein family of lawyers. Justice Bernstein has a remarkable and long list of amazing accomplishments to his credit. Graduate of Northwestern University School of Law, practicing attorney, elected Michigan State Supreme Court judge at age 40, and Ironman triathlete.
That's an impressive resume for anyone, Michael. But add to that fact that Richard Bernstein was born blind. Now you begin to get an idea of what this Ironman is made of. And though his story is remarkable in so many ways, it's the work he's undertaken on behalf of others with physical and mental disabilities that is perhaps his greatest achievement. Justice Bernstein, welcome to My Healthy Mind.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. It's a wonderful show, and I love the topic.
Thank you so much. Your story has what most people would consider a very difficult beginning, being born blind. But you yourself didn't think of it that way.
No, I think that I'm a very spiritual, religious person, and I really believe that we're given our life experiences for a reason. And so often, if you can take those experiences and use them to have an impact, it allows for you to find mission, purpose, and identity, and that creates a very full and meaningful life.
You also credit your family with making your life while growing up quite normal and shielding you from what could have been a traumatic childhood.
Well, I think it's more just the idea that we lived with the perspective that anything and everything was possible. And there was just a real energy in our household that was, the world is an exciting, wondrous place. And ultimately, I think that whenever you have a special needs child, like I was, there's always a balance. You have to balance between independence and safety. And my family found that perfect balance, but they erred more on the side of independence. And I think through that level of independence, it created the life that I have a chance to live now.
Can you talk about how they created a seamless transition for you, going to school and having the means to provide that type of lifestyle for you?
I am just blessed to have the opportunity to be on a show like this and have a job that I love and have the experience I get to have. But if I didn't come from an affluent background where I was exposed to the absolute best of everything, best of schools, best of education, best of whatever you can imagine, the only thing that's different from me is I was born into the right family with the financial resources to create opportunities.
And you don't recall being treated differently?
If there's one thing that I hope people can take away from our time together, is that life is about phases. There are going to be certain points in your life that are easier, and there's going to be certain points in your life that are harder. When you survive it, you go on to do things and experience things that you never imagined possible.
So that's a perfect segue into college.
Well, actually, I quite enjoyed college. I actually enjoyed college much more than high school. And the reason that I really liked college was because I was independent. I was able to make my own path. I was able to create my own way. College was a great growth experience.
So now let's dive into law school.
Okay.
Once you got there, you did have some academic challenges, right? Because you almost gave up during some tough moments.
So law school was incredibly challenging. There's just no other way to say it. So in law school, I'd have to memorize all the materials. And again, the key emphasis is if it took you an hour to do something, it takes me 5 hours to do the exact same thing. That's how tough law school was. And the reason I do what I do is because when I was at Northwestern, I actually made a promise that if I was given the chance to graduate, I would dedicate my entire life to representing people with special needs and disabilities who otherwise didn't have access to the judicial system. And when I graduated from law school, I went back to our family's practice, our family's law firm, and established our public services division. And we represented people free of charge on a pro bono basis who had severe disabilities to give them a better life and better access to programs and services.
After law school, you applied to 65 law firms.
That's correct.
You did all this hard work while blind.
Correct.
And you still got 0 job offers.
That's correct. So in '98, Northwestern had a 100% job placement. 100%. That means 100% of the students that interviewed for jobs all got jobs. When I interviewed 65 law firms that came to the Northwestern campus. Of those law firms that came on campus, I didn't get a single callback. We're not talking about getting an interview. We're not talking about getting a job. I didn't even get an interview. And I'm kind of okay with that because it's a good lesson about what it's like to be disabled and what some of the challenges are that you're going to face in this world.
But you're okay with it now, and it was a great lesson, but at the time, what was your state of mind? It must have been very discouraging and frustrating because you had put in all that work and
Right.
not resulting in a job.
I get discouraged and frustrated every single day. That's just life. I think sometimes people that have a little bit more struggle and hardship in their life, you just kind of have a certain resilient nature that kind of allows you to kind of keep like pushing forward.
Stress, depression, and severe mental illness can happen to anyone. Team Wellness Center has been helping those struggling with these conditions in southeastern Michigan.
They get a chance to know that somebody's on their team.
We think nobody else feels the pain that we feel. We feel like I'm the only one. But that is so untrue.
Within 24 hours of reaching out to our team, members receive psychiatric evaluations and begin the necessary treatment for recovery.
Working through my problems and seeing that I'm not the only one that has to cope has really brought me to a place where now it's okay to talk about it.
Because if you keep stuff to yourself, you can't overcome. We all need one another.
Team Wellness Center. You are not alone.
So, Justice Bernstein, you spent 4 decades developing the mechanisms and coping skills that allow you to keep up to speed with the other 6 justices on the Michigan Supreme Court. Mm-hmm. How do you manage to stay normal with this kind of regimen?
So the day is usually a 12 to 15 hour day, but it has to be regimented, has to be structured. I have to work on a schedule. I have to work when my clerks are able to work. I can't just pick up a brief and read it whenever I want to at like 11 o'clock at night. I have to read the brief when my clerks are available and open and able to kind of work with me on it.
Please talk about the intense work of memorizing. You had to memorize the cases, correct?
Absolutely. What happens on the Supreme Court, as it pertains to kind of how law school would prepare you for that, is every week you had 26 cases that are on our conference agenda every single Wednesday. And that's when we decide which cases we're going to grant leave to and which cases that we are not going to grant leave to. So what will happen is, in my situation, people say, well, do you use Braille, in order to process the information? And the answer is no, you cannot use Braille when you're blind and you're a Supreme Court justice because the material is too voluminous. So then people say, well, do you use a computer? And the answer is no, you cannot use a computer because if you're using a computer, you're not able to communicate with your colleagues. So do you know how I do it?
How?
I memorize all the cases.
How?
I learn them all. I basically spend 12, 15 hours a day working with my clerks, and we internalize all the materials and we internalize all the cases. And then what will happen is that the commissioner is going to say, we are now on case 18. Case 18 is a carjacking that resulted in 2 homicides. If I hear carjacking and 2 homicides, I'm able to recall that case in its entirety.
So can you please tell me what internalize means, and are they reading the material to
Yes,
you and
so-
repeating it over and over?
So what I get is 1 additional clerk, and what will happen is that we will dive into each case, and a lot of it is through repetition, but it just takes a lot of time because there is just so much material that we have to get through that it requires a tremendous amount of time to do that. And there's one other complication. You have to cite all the common law cases that are on point. So there's going to be a litany of cases that are relevant to the case that you're arguing for that you have to know. Not only do you have to argue the cases that are on point that work for you, you have to be able to navigate through all the cases that work against you. So you have to know all the cases that are in favor of your position, and you have to know all the cases that work against your position so that you can argue effectively in conference to persuade your colleagues as to your position.
So you've been working on behalf of people with disabilities. So can you tell us about some of those cases, such as the case with the Paralyzed Veterans of America?
I'd love to talk about some of those cases. So the first case that I ever kind of worked on that I was very passionate about was against the Detroit Department of Transportation. And you had people with disabilities, mainly veterans, who couldn't access the bus system. And about 60% of the buses were operating with broken wheelchair lifts. And you had men and women, veterans, soldiers, who couldn't get to doctor's appointments, who couldn't go places, who couldn't do things because they'd spend hours waiting at a bus stop for a bus to come with a working lift. What was great about being an attorney was you could fight for those folks and you could actually create real change for people in a really significant way. And after 7 years, the system got fixed. And this actually set the guidelines and standards that is now used by all transit providers across the United States. The case that you're referring to was a case with the Paralyzed Veterans of America. And this was a really challenging case. And what was happening, and I think it's kind of relevant to this program, was that the University of Michigan was spending $350 million to renovate the stadium. But they wouldn't make it accessible for people with disabilities to use. And so you had a lot of people that were in ROTC, who were now part of the Paralyzed Veterans of America, that wanted to go to games and be a part of the community. That's where kind of I came in, and I represented the Paralyzed Veterans of America, and we litigated against the University of Michigan. This case went on for many years, but ultimately what happened was they had to rebuild the stadium and allow for it to become fully accessible, to allow for all people to use and enjoy it. It set the guidelines and standards for all commercial facilities across the United States. The other case that I really was passionate about was air travel. It wasn't always the case that people with disabilities could always fly. And one of the cases that we had was to fight with the industry to create industry standards for airport construction and how airlines basically have hiring policies and protocols to allow for anyone with a disability who wants to travel to have the opportunity to do so. So that's what was great about the law, was you really could make change that genuinely affected the lives of people.
With that, you're talking about the landmark settlement you had with Delta
Correct.
Airlines and Detroit Metro Airport.
That's correct. And that is now the industry standard that's used for all aviation.
Another one I'd like you to please talk about is the case where you represented disabled citizens against the Oakland County Road Commission that
Sure.
created the roundabout traffic circles with no access for disabled people.
So that was an interesting case. Was basically the counties were basically building roundabouts. They were taking away conventional traffic signals and putting in roundabouts. So the idea of a roundabout is the traffic never stops. It has to be a continual flow. So the county was basically making the argument, they do this in Europe all the time. Well, that's true, but in Europe and Asia, where they have roundabouts, they have underground passages or bridges. So you might have a roundabout, but you can go under or you can go over. Here, they were just putting in roundabouts, but there was no way to get across the street if you couldn't see. There's just no way. So that had to go into litigation, and basically the counties had to basically create a structure that allows for roundabouts to exist, but with traffic control signals so that people who are blind can navigate it safely. And it's just an example of what is good for the disabled is good for everybody. So if you do something that's going to help a disabled person, it's ultimately going to help everybody as well.
That is especially true for your work in the area of education, where you've had some of your biggest challenges, but some of your most important wins. Can you talk about those?
Within education?
Yes.
Well, I think education is really the fundamental critical area. I mean, a lot of the things I've been passionate about started, right after I graduated from law school, when Governor Engler was going to cut special education programs and services. And we actually kind of developed an entire litany of people and organized an entire movement, with people with special needs, and went from county to county and challenged the governor to protect special education programs and services and funding. And a lot of times what you realize, when you're disabled or when you have a special need, is you've got to be active. You've got to be out there. You've got to be organized.
And you did some of this advocacy work in a federal suit against the American Bar Association regarding the law school admissions test?
Yes, that was a while back, and that was a really interesting situation because for standardized tests, people with disabilities really struggle with that. And the reason it's so hard is because here's a typical question on the LSAT. A, B, C, D, E, and F go into a restaurant. If A is next to C and B is next to D and E is next to A, where is C in relation to D and B? Now, in order to answer that question, you have to diagram. And it actually says diagram in the space provided, but a blind person can't diagram. So what happens is that these tests are inherently biased. They're inherently prejudiced because there's no way that a blind person can answer that question because it requires you to draw and to diagram. And so it was really quite problematic because if you wanted to go to law school, you had to take the LSAT. Now, this is not the bar. The bar exam is fine. There's no issue with the bar. It's a knowledge-based exam. The LSAT was an IQ exam. It was testing your IQ, your ability to draw a picture or do a diagram, which is not appropriate for a blind person to do because it's a skill set that we don't have. I can't draw a picture, but yet you were required to do that if you wanted to go to law school. And so any blind person that took the exam did horribly on it. And they wouldn't have access to great schools, and that was a problem, and that needed to be corrected.
Most recently, you've challenged the City of New York to make Central Park and all parks safer for visitors and accessible for people with disabilities and visual impairments. Can you talk about that?
So that was a really interesting experience. And I was walking in the pedestrian lane of Central Park, and as I walked, a bicyclist was going over 35 miles an hour. And he was going so fast that he lost control and hit me in the back. And it shattered my hip and my pelvis. And it required over 10 weeks of hospitalization at New York's Mount Sinai Hospital. 10 weeks of hospitalization. It was very difficult. When I was in the hospital, I was just going through so much pain. I mean, the pain was just, it's indescribable. It's hard to explain what that feeling is like. So I said to myself, I have to find a purpose to this. This can't just be a tragedy. This can't just be some sad thing. There has to be a purpose. There has to be a reason for this. And I have to find it because I can't just go through and live with this horrible chronic pain that I'm going to have for the rest of my life if it was just a happenstance, if it was just something which was just unfortunate. So ultimately what I did was I litigated against New York. I didn't ask them for money. I didn't ask them for a dime, a nickel, or a cent. I asked them for nothing. But I wanted them to fix Central Park. And ultimately, we fought with the city for about 5 years. It was a battle with the city of New York. But in the end, after some pretty intense fighting, the city has made substantial changes to the park. They have taken traffic out of the park. They've put in new traffic control signals. They have repaved the surfaces of the roads. They've put in new speed limits. They're enforcing speed limits. There's a litany of things that they're doing. And in fact, there's some future projects that are hopefully being discussed to put tunnels in to make it easier to cross under. But the key is that there are still people getting injured. There's still people getting hurt. And there's still lots of problems. But in my situation, I could look at it and say that we made the situation a little bit better. It will always be problematic, but at least we can cling to the idea that we made it a little bit better than it was.
My job was causing me so much stress.
I felt disconnected and frightened.
I felt so isolated.
I was beginning to feel trapped, depressed. I never expected that to happen to me.
We think nobody else feels the pain that we feel, but that is so untrue.
It's good to be able to talk about it.
I was able to seek help. I found it from Team Wellness.
It's a sense of freedom.
Team Wellness Center. You are not alone. At Team Wellness Primary Care Center, you will find all the basic services you need to be well and stay well. Come in for all your screenings. Come in for routine physicals and checkups. Come in for full-service dentistry. Come in for vaccinations and immunizations. At Team Wellness Primary Care Center, we take care of your total health. Team Wellness Primary Care Center. Come on in.
So, you are a Michigan Supreme Court Justice,
Right.
a tireless advocate for protecting the rights and safety of people with and without disabilities, a political science professor, a nationally and internationally sought-after speaker, and an inductee in the National Jewish Sports Hall of Fame. So, what do you do in your spare time?
So I love athletics, and I've been blessed to have had the opportunity of completing 24 marathons and a full Ironman competition. And what I think is interesting is people are always curious, how does a blind person do 24 marathons and an Ironman? And the way it works is I work with a team called Achilles. And Achilles is an amazing group of people. And you run with a team of guides. And what they do is you hold a tether. So I hold one part of the rope and my guide will hold the other. And as you're running, they will give you directional cues. Hard right, soft right, hard left, soft left. And you follow those directional cues as you run. So that's how you do the marathon. People will ask, how do you do an Ironman, if you're blind? So an Ironman is a 2.4 mile swim followed by a 112 mile bike to be completed by a 26.2 mile run. So the rules of the Ironman is you cannot rest or take a break. If you rest or take a break and you miss a cutoff, you're immediately disqualified from the competition. If you finish at 12:05 instead of 12 o'clock, it's like you were never even there. And I want you to think about it. 2 years of effort, work, and training will literally be for nothing. So let's picture what it would be like as you dive into like a frigid body of water. You have no idea where you are or where you're going. So if your guide's underwater and you're underwater, you're not able to communicate with each other. You can't speak with each other. So you have to kind of feel the motion as they pull on the tether, because there's a lasso around your waist and around their waist. And they basically will pull you in different directions as an indication as to which way you should swim. It gets challenging because you're the only like disabled swimmer, and all the other swimmers are swimming around you and over you. They actually call it the washing machine in the Ironman. And they don't realize that you're blind, right? They don't know that you can't see, so they just see you as another competitor, so they just swim right over you. And then a lot of times what happens is you'll get kicked in the face. And when you're blind, you can't brace for the impact. And then there's one last challenge. Other swimmers become entangled in the rope that connects you to your guide. So as they become entangled in the rope, it will take you below the surface. And you literally start to feel like you're drowning. So you have to work in a very methodical, peaceful, spiritual way with your guide, and just get yourself untangled, get yourself unsnared, and then move forward. And then guess what? 20 minutes later, the whole thing happens all over again. And then after you finish your swim, so you've done your 2.4 mile swim, now you gotta do your 112 mile bike. Now, 112 miles in the mountains can be very challenging. And you ride in a tandem bike. So the guide is in the front and you're in the back and you're pedaling. And you pedal together as a team. What the guide's gonna do is, the guide's gonna give you a command. The guide's gonna say, lean right, lean left, hard lean right, soft lean left. And you have to pay attention to every word your guide is saying. Because if your guide says to you, hard lean right, and you don't lean to the right and he does, the bike is gonna flip over because you can't have the disproportionate weight. So you're going at speeds of sometimes of an excess of 45 miles an hour. That's how fast it gets. Because you have to have enough velocity going down the mountain to build up enough strength to go up the next mountain. You gotta be focused and you gotta work as a team. Because if you're not, that's where injuries can develop. And then after you finish the cycling portion, then it's easy, then you just do your marathon. And it's just your standard 26.2, And that's just your hard right, soft right, hard left, soft left, with the guide giving you the directional cues. But I will say this, the one thing that you learn from an experience like that, and I think it's a powerful lesson that I took, and I think it's relevant to the healthy mind, is you really come to realize through a spiritual sense that people like me were very mortal. And in many situations, a lot of folks like us who have disabilities who are created with infirmity. But I think what you realize from a spiritual sense is that in many circumstances, the body is mortal, and for a lot of people, we have a lot of infirmities. But what you come to realize is it's our spirits and it's our souls that give us resilience and strength that allow for us to truly basically disconnect from the body and allow for us to touch the heavens.
In a few words, what message would you like to leave with our viewers today?
I can tell you unequivocally, through pain and setback and struggle, that we develop empathy. And it's through empathy that we're able to connect. And it's through connection that we realize the most powerful thing of all, which is that yes, our bodies are mortal and our bodies are infirmed, but it is our spirits and it is our souls that truly have no limitations.
Thank you for joining us today with Justice Richard Bernstein, tireless advocate for disabled rights, who shared his powerful message of optimism, determination, and grit. By putting his own mind and will to work, he has shown us all that even with a disability, there's almost nothing that can't be achieved. If you'd like to learn more about this or any mental health issue, please visit us at myhealthymind.com, follow us on Twitter at myhealthymind, or on Facebook. We'll see you next week for another edition of My Healthy Mind. Let's talk about it.